I'm a Legislative and Government Relations Coordinator here at Oregon Housing and Community Services. As part of the Government Relations team, we closely track and monitor all that the legislature is doing at any given time. We're also working to execute our agency's legislative agenda. We're currently getting ready for the 2027 long session here in Salem. And so I just wanted to give a little bit of a glimpse of what's happening in the broader landscape of the Oregon political realm and how that's going to be impacting our work over the course of the next few years. So just to get started, I want to talk about where we are in the legislative cycle. And I apologize if this is a little remedial for some of y'all who do track it very closely, but Oregon alternates every year between having a long session and a short session. We just completed the short session earlier this year in February of 2026. Generally, the long sessions last about 6 months and last from about February until the end of June or early July of all of the odd number years. So that's going to be the phase that we're heading into now. It's the long session years when agency budgets are developed and passed. So that is going to be the bulk of our workload as we move through this next period. Right now, members of the legislature who expect to return to their seats are busy filing their pre-session bills. So that allows them to get a bit of a head start on some policy development for ideas that they would like to execute in the 2027 legislative session. We've gotten many inquiries from legislative offices about some of those concepts, and we're answering questions and providing factual information where we can about our programs to help inform the development of those policies. Just wanted to talk a little bit about some outcomes from the last legislative session. That is the short session in early 2026. The main discussion that period was budgets, which will come as no surprise to folks. There was a budget rebalancing bill that I think affected almost every state agency. We are definitely entering a more constrained budget environment than we have seen in years past. Most agencies saw either a neutral change or very slim cuts to some staff or program scope in that rebalancing bill. The legislature also took some steps to try to mitigate the impact of some less than favorable revenue news, like the federal disconnect, which separated Oregon's tax code from some components of the federal tax code. And also, obviously, the transportation package and how we were planning on funding that is a major topic of conversation, which I think we can expect to see again in 2027 as well, considering how that ended up playing out on the ballot. So, not quite there yet. We're actually just approaching, right now this is considered the interim. It's between the different legislative sessions. Some work is still happening behind the scenes. We're actually going to be coming up on a set of legislative days where the legislature does meet in Salem for a few days for mostly housekeeping businesses, make sure the lights are on, address any other emergencies as they arise. I believe September 8th, 9th, and 10th, we're going to be down here again talking to the folks, and in the event that any of them request presentations on any of our programs, we will be presenting to some of those committees on whatever they request. The other major component of this is the revenue forecasts. We are expecting our next revenue forecast in August of this year. There will be another later in the year in November, another in February, and then finally there will be a May revenue forecast, which will coincide with the conclusion of the 2027 session. And that May revenue forecast will be the one that most agency budgets will most largely be determined by. That will be the final and most accurate snapshot of the state's finances that we will get before the legislature has to finalize the legislatively approved budget. In the most recent May revenue forecast, we did see slightly better than expected returns, but it did seem like from the data that was somewhat of an aberration based on an increase in income from top earners, whereas most wage earners in the state did not see increases in revenue, which led to a decrease in general fund dollars overall, even if we were somewhat buoyed by the income from top earners. So we are unsure how that will pan out for the remainder of the year. We and many others are continuing to closely track those revenue forecasts, which will inform the bulk of the discussion. I believe now we can move on to the next slide, Annabelle. Thank you. Just want to talk a little bit about what we can expect in the next legislative session. Like I said, the long sessions are when biennial agency budgets are developed. Last long session, you all might recall, our agency budget bill was House Bill 5011. However, that was not the entirety of where our funding came from. And so the totality of our agency budget is both our main agency budget bill and any other bills that do ultimately allocate revenue to any of our agency's programs. So it's a bit more complicated than just one. We are currently working on our agency request budget and developing our legislative concepts and policy options packages for the coming year. One other thing I will point out too is that I think we are very likely to continue having dedicated policy committees for housing in both chambers of the legislature. It's very favorable to make sure that we have the necessary bandwidth to have the discussions that we need to be able to advance some of our issues. It also looks very likely at this point that the leadership for both of those committees will remain unchanged as we move into next year. There are obviously some variables there, but that seems to be the case now. Which I do think is extremely helpful in informing those policy conversations, because it means the folks who have the gavel and get to decide what moves forward will have an existing understanding of our agency, our programs, and some of the work that we've done. We've worked very closely with Senator Pham, who chairs the Senate Housing Committee, as well as Representative Marsh, who has chaired the House Housing and Homelessness Committee for the last couple of cycles now as well. I will also point out that while the leadership of those committees is unlikely to change, there will in fact be elections this coming November, which at a minimum will mean 14 new members of the legislature just based on open seats right now. That number could change and go higher if we see any surprises. But there will be a substantial number of legislators that we will be reaching out to proactively to make sure that they understand the intricacies of some of our work and the importance of making sure that it's funded at the appropriate levels and what the impacts are if they're not. So those are going to be conversations that we have ongoing. We're also expecting to see an even greater amount of turnover in legislative staff, which is very common between sessions, especially as we enter long sessions. So a lot of what our team will be doing is building relationships with those staff, working closely with them on developing concepts, both our own and the concepts that their offices come up with independently that they ask for us to provide some information around. And that's what we're going to be doing between now and the start of session in February. I will also point out that after the elections in November, there will be an internal election within the legislature to decide the broader leadership of both chambers, separate from the committees. However, those leadership elections will also result in new committee assignments. So while I think we can expect some consistency with the folks who are chairing the housing committees in both the Senate and the House, we can expect some change and turnover in who's actually serving on those committees as well. So the folks that will actually be playing the most hands-on role in developing some of the bills that impact our agency, these are folks that we're also going to have to be proactive in reaching out to once those committee assignments are complete. So that's when we will know the full scope of the legislators who will be most hands-on for our issues. I do think overall the main focus for this coming session is going to be on efficiency, finding savings opportunities wherever possible. I know that no agency has been spared from this so far, but we're really looking to triage damage in the event that we are facing a much more constrained budget environment as well. And again, this is enterprise-wide, not just specific to OHCS. Next slide, please, Angela. So just to talk a little bit about the budget realities, we'll get into the details about what this means specifically for the Housing Stabilization Division, which I support in a bit. But first, I just wanted to talk about the fact that we are very likely going to be entering a much more constrained budget environment overall than we've seen probably in 15 years, maybe more. So far, there have been reduced general fund revenues and increased costs for virtually every program area within the state. We have received an enterprise-wide guidance, which all agencies are following, to only proceed with budget neutral concepts or policy option packages for the 2027 session. That does not mean that we will be strictly limited only to that once session occurs. And we are in conversation with the governor's office to highlight other areas that will require additional investment. But as it stands for our agency request budget, we will be limited only to revenue neutral concepts and policy options packages. There are some exceptions to this as well. There are some programs that have alternative funding sources available or other housing finance mechanisms at their disposal. I'm thinking specifically of certain bond funding. So other programs like our Affordable Rental Housing Division will still be able to proceed with some concepts that they're exploring that would allow new dollars to go towards building new houses or preservation and so on. But what we're not seeing is any new general fund dollar asks for any of those programs. This is why, and we'll get into this in a bit, for the Housing Stabilization Division, they're going to be most directly impacted by some of these directives because that division relies more on general fund dollars than most of the other divisions within the agency. So just wanted to kind of set the scene there for a bit so folks know what we're going to be looking at. Annabelle, we go to the next slide. And just to kind of give a bit of an overview about where we're at in the budget process, the agency request budget is what we are currently working on now. And that is an exhaustive overview of all of our agency's programs, how they work, how they function, a very deep dive into the finances of each one. And the result of that is what we ultimately request and put forward as the starting point for the budget discussion. It is by no means the final version of our budget. In fact, it is only the first stage, and as you can see, in this graph on the screen, we're somewhere down in the bottom section right now. Our agency request budget should be finalized and released by September 1st of this year, at which point we will see the process pivot over to the governor's office, and she will also have a few months to work on that and alter the ARB such that she's able to inform it with her own priorities. And we should see the governor's recommended budget submitted and made public in December. That itself becomes yet another starting point for the discussion that occurs during the legislative session. And it's important to keep in mind that it is ultimately the responsibility of the legislature to decide agency budgeting. So they will take both the ARB and the GRB into account as they proceed with their discussions. It will go to a variety of different committees, but most likely those decisions will be made in the joint Ways and Means committees for actually allocating those resources to our agencies and its various programs. That will take place throughout January until June of 2027, and we will see a finalized legislatively approved budget bill at the end of the 2027 session. That's typically how that process works. If we can go to the next slide, Annabelle. And just kind of laying out in a little bit more detail what each of that step in the process looks like. Again, the ARB is where we're just laying out the agency finances and the various policies that we would like them to consider. And then turn that over to the governor's office, which in turn informs the governor's recommended budget with her own priorities, including some from the agency as well, released around December 1st. And then that all gets handed off to the legislature, which includes all budget bills enacted into the law by the legislature, adopted at the end of the session. And then, of course, there can be changes made after the fact as well, either through the emergency board, which is what typically meets during those legislative days like the ones coming up in September, or if a special session is called, which is not unheard of. Many of y'all might recall there was one called last year as well to address the transportation package that hadn't quite made it through the 2025 legislative session. So those are the various mechanisms that could ultimately impact what our agency budget bill will look like for the next biennium. We're tracking that very closely right now. And we're going to keep an eye on the process as we get closer to releasing our ARB. Thank you, Annabelle. For 2027, we have a handful of legislative concepts that we are going to be putting forward as an agency. I'm going to talk through just a little bit with some cheat sheets here from some of my colleagues in the other divisions that support that work because they are much more closely familiarized with some of the other work. But for the Affordable Rental Housing Division, I'm going to go out of order here. For the permanent supportive housing piece that they have, oh, sorry, I'm actually looking at the wrong note here. Let me just go through this one instead. So for home ownership, they have a handful that they're going to be looking at, including the directed loan delivery program, which will actually just increase the number of loans that we are able to offer on a monthly basis for folks. Similarly, for the short-term capital financing, that would also increase the number of loans that we're able to make, because right now both of those programs are strictly limited in the total number, such that if the market is fluctuating at a relatively high rate, it could unnaturally limit the amount of loans that we're actually able to issue to borrowers. So we're looking for some additional flexibility on both of those that would allow that to no longer be as much of an issue. There is also the MMCRC fee increase, which is our Manufactured and Marina Community Resources Center. This is a program that helps folks in aforementioned marinas and manufactured home parks with necessary upgrades and so on. This fee increase would allow for the program to remain sustainable for the next several biennium. There are also some other options that are being explored, one that would allow for continued service level and others that might also expand the scope of some of the additional services like mediation and legal representation that those programs are able to offer folks in that situation. For supportive housing, that establishes the supportive housing program in statute with 3 tiers, which include permanent supportive housing for individuals experiencing chronic homelessness, intensive permanent supportive housing for people in existing institutions with high behavioral health needs, and service-enriched options for those requiring moderate or limited assistance. For the Oregon Affordable Housing Tax Credit, this allows unused tax credits caps to be sold, generating capital from the investment. And it also sets up a fund to pair the sold credits with philanthropic or other private donations. And then for pre-development, that actually just looks to add pre-development as an eligible use for the Housing Development and Guarantee Fund. And now turning the attention to the ones that I'm much more familiar with for the Housing Stabilization Division, we have two concepts that we're going to be moving forward with for the upcoming session. The first is relating to the Tribal Housing Grant Fund, which many of y'all are familiar with, possibly under its former name, the BAFI-NATO program, the Buy-in For Initiative for the Native American Tribes of Oregon. We received $10 million in allocated dollars for the Tribal Housing Grant Fund for this current biennium. Unfortunately, those funds live in a general fund account, which means they are time restricted. And so if the tribal organizations that are granted those funds have not exhausted their allocation within a 2-year period, those funds must be returned to the general fund. What we have heard from consultation with tribal governments is that this is not particularly conducive to their internal processes, and we want to be responsive to that need. So what we are proposing is a bill that would create an other funds account, which would not be time limited in its use for those dollars to sit within. This should address the need for aligning our processes with the tribe's internal decision-making processes on how to use these dollars. It will also allow them to roll over funds from one biennium to the next if they would like to combine those resources into a larger community project. But the underlying theme here is to make sure that they are best able to meet the needs of their community in the way that they see fit. There is also a component to this too that we're looking at that would allow us to negotiate directly with tribes to develop a more flexible set of eligibility criteria for the folks that are being served by the dollars in the Tribal Housing Grant Fund. There are a few different mechanisms that we're looking at the moment that would achieve that goal. But again, the underlying theme here is to make sure that we can provide them as much flexibility as they need and be as responsive to the requests that we've received from tribal governments and our tribal partners to make sure that they're actually meeting the needs of their community. And then similarly, the other concept, which actually is going to be living within the agency-wide technical fix bill, which is a series of relatively minor rule change, technical fix things that are designed to clean up the statutory language that we work around. There was an issue in the last long session around the passage of House Bill 3644, which y'all might remember as the statewide shelter program bill, which created that program. That was funded with $204 million in our agency budget bill as well. One of the things that was brought to our attention immediately after session had concluded was that tribal governments were actually excluded from the definition of who could serve as a regional coordinator for the statewide shelter program. That had never been our intention. It was not the intention of anyone that was involved in the steering committee or the policy development work groups who had put together that bill. It was really an oversight that was just noticed after the fact. So we're introducing a technical fix that will explicitly add tribal governments to the list of entities who are eligible to serve as regional coordinators. There are also some other minor technical restrictions that might make it practically difficult for a tribe to serve in that role. For instance, there's a geographic limitation. It says that a regional coordinator can't serve an area smaller than one county, which would also not particularly work well for tribal governments. So we are also creating an exemption to tribal governments serving as regional coordinators that would allow them to serve their own community without having to worry about the other geographic restriction. So those are the two main ones that we're going to be proceeding with as far as legislative concepts. Annabelle, next slide, please. Yes, policy option packages. Now, I'm going to focus on the Housing Stabilization Division for this one as well, because I mentioned before, the other divisions are less restricted by the enterprise-wide guidance about keeping everything net neutral as far as new dollars. Affordable rental housing does have some proposals for new bond dollars for development, both with LIFT and PSH. There's also some unknowns around the Affordable Rental Preservation and Stabilization Program, as well as the Portfolio Expansion Compliance Capacity. It's unclear what the dollar amount is, but we're still working on actively developing some of those concepts right now. And then similarly in the Homeownership Division, they've got some moving around of dollars, as well as an Article 11Q bond proposal for LIFT for homeownership. And then there will likely also be an additional bond dollar ask for preservation of manufactured home communities as well. But for housing stabilization, we do not have any policy option packages that we are going to be moving forward in our agency request budget this year. Again, we have no revenue neutral pops. So since most of our programs are general fund funded, we are following the enterprise-wide guidance to not submit anything that asks for new general fund dollars. Our main priority for this session as we're entering budget conversations is going to be maintaining to the fullest capacity that we can the amount of funding that we have right now for eviction prevention, rehousing, shelter, long-term rent assistance, and basically everything within our HSD portfolio that is relying on general fund dollars at the moment. And then just a little bit of level setting for some of those programs, and we've got them divided up into these 5 separate buckets. But I wanted to go through some of this because I think I've heard personally a lot of folks who are still unclear about exactly where things landed at the end of last session. There's been a little bit of confusion about maintaining our existing funding level and what that means relative to current service level funding. And so I just wanted to break it down for us a little bit. For shelter, we received for the 25-27 biennium $204.9 million for the statewide shelter system. Of that, only half, about $102 million, is built in as continued service level funding for this following session. So that will be the starting point of the conversation for what's considered current service level for funding. This does not mean that that is the final number that will land at the end of the legislative session. There are a lot of things that could happen, but that is going to be the beginning point of that discussion. Unless we see something different in the governor's recommended budget in December, which we very well may. For the rehousing piece, we received $50.3 million for that, again, in our agency budget bill, and approximately half of that was allocated to CSL as well. I will point out for both of those two also that even though it is CSL, it is not set to continue in perpetuity. They did include what they call a sunset on that bill as well, which means in the event that no other action is taken to extend it, which is a very common practice, and these actions are taken to extend these timelines all the time, that funding would expire in 2034, which is also true for the Tribal Housing Grant Fund dollars, and we'll get to that in a moment too. For the long-term rental assistance program, we received $87.4 million for the 25-27 biennium. That was all one-time funding. So that would be the area that would see the biggest drop off in the event that there is no new general fund dollars that are allocated for it. Some of the money was to continue LTRA in the executive order regions. Another portion was to expand the LTRA into the balance of state regions and other parts of the state. But all of that is one-time funding for this biennium. And so as far as, say, our agency request budget goes, we don't have an additional ask for new long-term rental assistance dollars included in there at this point. I will also say for all of these that we are in regular communication with the governor's office about the opportunities for investment that we will need for several of these programs and what the impacts would be in the event that we don't get it. So I don't think that just because there has been this enterprise-wide guidance about no new general fund dollar requests for anything means that that's absolutely where everything will land. The governor's office has demonstrated a very acute concern about what the implications of some of that could be. And so we know this is on their radar. And we're going to make sure that this stays on their radar as well. For eviction prevention, this one is even more complicated than some of the others because at the end of session, we received $44.6 million for eviction prevention, but that actually came from 2 separate bills. 33.6 of that was allocated to us in our agency budget bill, House Bill 5011. But there was also what they call a Christmas tree bill at the end of the session where everybody gets something in the Christmas tree bill. And for us, what we got was an additional $11 million to help fund some of the eviction prevention services, which had still seen a pretty substantial cut of over 66% or so from the previous biennium. But this put us at a total of $44.6 million, 33.6 of which the part in our budget bill is included fully as CSL and with no sunset. So those dollars in theory should be continuing in perpetuity, again, as the starting point of the conversation. Anything could shift throughout the legislative session, and it is ultimately up to the legislature to decide what numbers they're going to land on for funding levels for these programs. And then lastly, we received $10 million this past biennium for the Tribal Housing Grant Fund, again, in our agency budget bill 5011. Of that, much like some of the other programs, half of it was allocated to us as CSL with a sunset in 2034. Now, I'm not going to be shocked if folks' heads are spinning a little bit because there's a lot of complexity involved in that, and I do have time for questions set up at the end of this as well. I'm happy to get into some more of this. But that is the budget reality that we will be entering as we get closer to the 2027 session. I really appreciate y'all's time. Happy to answer any questions y'all have about any of the things that we went through. Yes.
Got a philosophical approach question,
Mhm.
and given that we're in an environment where we are likely not even going to be able to meet CSL, nonetheless, probably have some pullback. Is OHCS approaching that with a dilute everything if there's cuts, or are there targeted program areas where that's where they would plan to take the cuts if they needed to happen to preserve other things?
That is a great question. I think that I would probably need to defer to someone above my pay grade here on that one, as far as what direction they would go. I think that right now, there's still so much uncertainty about what's going to end up happening. Historically, and certainly within the last handful of years, even in the face of relatively bleak budget forecasting news, we have still seen some pretty historic levels of investment into our program areas, especially within the Housing Stabilization Division, either at the last minute or through executive orders or other one-off bills or special sessions. It's not clear to me that there's still going to be the appetite to see more of those last minute, save the day levels of investment. But at the same time, we've also had several conversations with legislators who are acutely aware of what the impacts would be if they do see reductions in some of these programs. So we're just going to have to continue those conversations, both internally and externally, and with the legislature. We will likely take some cues from them if we get specific direction to do so about how they would like us to best prioritize the remaining dollars that we receive. I hope that helps answer the question. Any others? Seeing none, I'll leave y'all to it. Thank you so much.
I did also want to just provide a quick opportunity for those online. Amber, was there someone that had a question or? Nope. Okay. All right. In that case, we will transition over to Beth Brown. And if you give us a moment, we will get her set up here.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me again. I think this is my third year here. My name is Beth Brown. I'm the controller here at OHCS. I've been at this agency about 6.5 years. And some of the material may be review for some of you if you've been here the past few years, but some of the topics I'll be covering is I'll talk a little bit about my accounting team. We'll talk about OPUS quite a bit, which I'll go through what that is. We'll talk about access, requests for funds, advances, statuses within OPUS, processing timelines, reporting, closeout, spend down, and then I'll have some contacts for you. A little bit about my team. I have a team of 17 members, including myself. We do everything full cycle bookkeeping here for the agency outside of payroll. DAS does all of our payroll for us, but we do payables, receivables, program payments, and all those disbursements, federal draws, cost allocation, investment accounting, because we do issue our own bonds at this agency, reconciliation, financial statements, federal reporting. We also took on operating budgets this last year. And then of course we support all of the audits for all of the funds and programs that we have. Across the agency, we have 5 separate systems that support payment disbursements, just like OPUS supports all of your grants and funds. We track almost 100 different funding sources and over 90 different programs, including consisting of general fund, other fund, and federal fund. And then, of course, some of the funding sources support multiple programs, and some of the programs are funded with multiple funding sources. So it's not a one-to-one, but rather adds a lot of complexity. For the Housing Stabilization Division, including energy services, this past 13 months or so, we dispersed about $247 million. Some of the staff that I have working specifically to support housing stabilization and fund all of the funding that goes out the door Some of these names you'll see in emails or in meetings with me is Heather Oswald is our disbursements lead. And then we've got Carrie, Maria, Marilyn, Erica, Mohammed, and Angie. So there's a lot going on in the background. It takes about 4 or 5 of my staff just to get the payments out every single week. We fund every Wednesday, and it's not just the Housing Stabilization Division, but all divisions across the agency. So every week we're sending millions out the door. So some of these staff, they support the reconciliations, federal reporting. They also support our program staff in managing their funding and their obligations and commitments and things like that. We'll move into Opus Access. And so Opus is the system, and a lot of you may know this, but some of you that may not work with it or that are new, Opus is the system used to manage all of your grants and awards and funds. And it has an external facing portal where grantees, where all of you can go in and actually submit requests for funds is what we call them, for us to reimburse you for your grant expenditures. There are 3 modules within Opus. There's the fiscal, weatherization, and energy module. The fiscal module completed a conversion in January of this year to a new platform. And many of you helped with all of that. You provided some testing support, and then all of us migrated together, and it was extremely successful. So I just want to thank you all for your support and your participation in making that a success. The weatherization and energy module conversion is scheduled for March of 2027. And I understand that the project team and developers are going to be getting some information out to you all. Each agency has a local Opus administrator. So this administrator sets up new users, removes users, keeps those user agreements on file. So it's great to verify who your local Opus administrator is, as there are times staff leave and then you need access and nobody's there to do that for you. So it's good just to verify who that person is on your team. If you have any questions about that or need a new one set up, you can contact the Opus help desk and the email's right there. We'll move into the request for funds. So some reminders for you all about requests for funds. Again, this is when you're submitting those draw requests for funding from us. We do need documentation to support that request. General ledger detail out of your book of records system is preferred. Figures on the report should easily tie to the expended to date figures that you're submitting for each of those budget categories in your request for funds. If we think about like how many grantees, so at the end of 23-25, we had 70 grantees and 154 grants, and all of the requests for funds that my staff kind of had to review, and then program staff had to review. So if you can do anything to help us connect those dots, create that line of sight from here's the backup documentation to here's the amounts that you're requesting within your RFF to increase that efficiency for our teams, that would be much appreciated. If you want to make notes or highlight or anything like that, that'd be great. And furthermore, it helps our auditors. So our auditors actually have access into this system, and based on their sample selections, they will also pull your backup up and look at it and try to create that line of sight as well. So anything you can do to help make that easier, more efficient for all of us, it would be much appreciated and helps us in the end with our audits. Here's an example of what a request for funds looks like, and you can see the expended to date, and it might not show up very good. Oh, it doesn't look too bad. Okay. And then you've got the budget categories, and at the bottom is where we can see an attachment that you can attach. The next slide shows us an example of what a backup report could look like. And so we can see the income statement with all of the expenditures by budget category for this grant. So some proper fund accounting here that's easily identifiable for us. We can see those expenditure to date amounts match the expended to date in the categories that you've entered into the RFF. So this is just one example of what that could look like and how that can help us easily be able to identify those numbers. Moving into advances. So there are grants, and at times advances are available to be advanced up front instead of reimbursement based. Advances must be minimal and demonstrate the immediate need. And they need to be entered into the RFF in the projected field within Opus. And they must be justified with a relevant comment to support and substantiate the amount. Some examples are the number of applications in process, or subrecipient invoices are due, or even quantifiable payroll expenditures. And then energy services batches not yet paid, you can put that energy service batch number in the comment field and that's acceptable. And we had some issues with this a few years back and our auditors found there to be some challenges with what we were accepting. And so we've done a great job the past year or two. But some reminders about this, some acceptable comments, again, the batch number, if it's an energy batch, the payroll batch number with an amount, client applications for 15 households with an amount, and anything to substantiate that amount. And then we did receive unacceptable comments in the past, bills to be paid with a date, interim payment, or even blank. But we're all doing much better. So these are just reminders. And we appreciate your support in helping us have clean audits on our end. When you provide an expended to date figure and a projected amount, the general ledger backup and the comment must both be included then in that case. And then here's an example, agency request view for an RFF, where you can see at the very bottom is where the comment can go in. We've got a projected amount in here. And then the comment clarifies the batch number and amount and what it's for. And again, that would be supported. RFF statuses. I really appreciate the feature that Opus has with this because it gives you all visibility into where your request for funds and draw is in the process. So the prep and certified status are completed by you all. So you have somebody submit it and it's prepped, and then somebody approves it and it's certified. Accounting then processes it. We get it next and we look at all the backup. It then goes to program staff in OHCS and they approve the RFF. And then it comes back to accounting and we take it from there. And so we batch it, we draw federal funds, we put it in a ready to send status, and then we send it. And so if you on a Tuesday want to know if your draw got picked up and it's getting paid that week, if it's in batch status, you know that we're on it and we're including it in that week's batch. And then the next slide shows you kind of where you can see this. It's in the agency request view for the RFF. Again, you can see the prepped user, the certified user, the process user. So Marilyn is typically the processor in accounting. Then we've got program staff approving, and then Maria is typically the one that's batching and actually initiating all of those ACH payments. And then it also includes dates and times, which is also helpful if we have to do any research on where it's at and why it's stalled out somewhere. Reminders about processing timelines, and this hasn't changed much at all. We have the deadline for you all to submit requests for funds that are going to be included in the following week's processing is 1 p.m. on Friday. And then program staff have until 10 a.m. Monday to get those all approved. At 10 a.m. Monday, accounting then starts batching everything and we start drawing federal funds. And I'm sure some of you know some federal funds take 1 day to settle, some take 2 days to settle. So Monday and Tuesday, we're drawing down all of our federal funds. They settle on Wednesday, and that's when we then initiate all of the payments, record them, moved everything to sent status. Throughout the week, we are processing RFFs for the next week's payments, and program then is also approving RFFs for the next week's payments. When we process funds on Wednesday, it should settle in your account on Thursday. So I'm very happy this agency funds weekly. We understand the urgency of these funds and how it sustains all of your programs and needs within your communities. Some agencies, I understand, fund quarterly or monthly. So just know that if you miss a week's batch, you didn't get it in, you'll have an opportunity the next week. You don't have to wait a month or a quarter before you get your next funding. Excuse me. Holidays will shift payment processing by 1 day. So Monday through Thursday holidays will shift the payment, and then it will settle in your bank account on Friday. If the end of the month falls on a Wednesday, that will also shift it 1 day. And again, if the approval deadline's missed, it'll be picked up in the following week. You don't have to wait a month or a quarter. And then the other thing about Wednesday processing, again, a lot of my staff are not available to be on the call today because they're all batching and getting all of your payments out the door. And again, it's not just your payments, but the entire agency's payments are going out the door today. Some Opus reports you'll have access to. So there's this reports menu option at the top. And these are the reports you should have access to. So there's a notice of allocation. You can look at the grant that you're looking for, and it has all your budget categories. And if there are dollars here, then your funds are available and you can start drawing against those funds. The payment summary report, similar, but a little bit more detail. It does show you the notice of allocation award amount. So you see your award amount, You see the paid to date and what's remaining. So you can kind of see an overview of your grant in that case. And then the MGA payment detail report is a little bit more detailed if you need help kind of reconciling at that transaction level. When it comes to grant closeout, we like to see that, you know, your revenues and expenditures for that funding source are all reconciled. You submit all of your final RFFs through that period end date. And then we also need a financial status report for those grants that are actually closing out. And then the financial status report, or FSR is what we call them, needs to include the expenditures through the grant closeout date. In your grant closeout date, you may want to look at your grant agreement. Sometimes it's 45 days, sometimes 60 days. So to get that submitted within that grant period end date, we then reconcile and we'll return it to you if you need to correct anything or resubmit. Some grants may be able to roll, and so you can add a comment within your financial status report that you want it to roll. You can let us know. And then not all grants need an FSR if they are 2-year grants within OPUS. So as Casey was kind of sharing, we're in the middle of a biennium. This is not a biennium end. So the fiscal year end is just a little bit different. Not all grants are going to close out at the end of this fiscal year. And so they won't need an FSR. We do still on our side, however, have to report all the expenditures in the correct fiscal year. So we do encourage you to get all of those RFFs in that you can that are related to any expenditures prior to June 30. We would like those ASAP. Would be great. And then the next slide, Carrie's been sending out a couple of reminders about the grants that do close out and do need a financial status report. So those are listed here. So submit your RFFs, and then all of the FSRs along with these need to be submitted for us no later than August 30th. Here's an example of what an FSR financial status report looks like, and the award amount is entered for you, and you enter the expended to date amount for each of the budget categories. And then the next slide shows you an example of what the comment looks like. If you want it to roll, you can just put a comment in there that says, yes, I have remaining funds and I would like it to roll if the grant's allowed to roll. I'm going to echo some of what Mark said earlier about spend down. It is super critical. We are required to report out to external stakeholders, including the Legislative Fiscal Office, the status of our spend down. We rely on your consistent RFF submissions to be able to share that reporting and the status of all of that. If we think about the end of the biennium, it gets extremely critical, but that starts like in December, January. We will start getting requests to start reporting out. And right now we do report out quarterly. Starting in like January, we're going to be reporting every 2 weeks. Like it becomes that much more significant. They want to start estimating how much money are we going to get back, so that they can start planning and using that money for future needs in the future biennium. So we are required to report very early, starting in January, about every 2 weeks. And we don't have visibility on all of the commitments that you have on your legal contracts or funds that you've already expended. If you have not submitted your request for funds for those, we have no visibility on that. And when it comes down to the time to report out at that time, you know, the Legislative Fiscal Office has access to our general ledger system. They will pull the data and they will trend it. And so there's no narratives, there's no time or need for narratives at that point, even though there's a lot of context around all of that. That's not what they're looking at. They're looking at true data numbers. And so they're going to pull the data, trend it, and if there's significant gaps in RFF drawdowns, that trend doesn't look good, right? But if you can keep the RFF consistent, even if it's lagged or behind consistently, that trend looks much better. So some ideas in terms of how to keep your RFFs kind of consistent, maybe split apart your admin from your program draws. We know that, Amber, you have a. Sure. Great feedback. We will take that back to our developer. And the question I think was adding RFF numbers to one of the reports to be able to help with year-end reconciling. So we'll take that back to the developer and see what we can do. So to kind of help maybe minimize delay with RFS, I think I was stating like separate your admin draws from your program draws. We know that admin can take a little bit longer to close out when you close your books, then you allocate all of those admin costs. Yeah, but program draws, maybe you know what those expenditures are much quicker. And those are the larger dollars as well. So if you can keep those consistently being drawn down, again, it'll help with that trending of that data. When our partners start, our legislative fiscal office partners start pulling that data and trending it. I think that was it. I don't know what else I can say, but as Mark and I are stating, this is just really critical and really important to be able to tell our story and your story and continue to show the need of the services being provided in your communities and the ongoing need that's there. We're happy to meet and brainstorm, talk through your operations about any ways we can help, kind of identify ways to anything we can do to help you all be consistent with this. Let us know. And then I just have some contacts for you. So any questions around like Opus navigation or processing, if you want more like one-on-one training for your agency regarding Opus technical, mechanical type stuff. If you have draw status questions or RFF void requests, those can go to our mga.fiscal email address. You have my contact at any time if you need to escalate something, you feel we're not being responsive enough, or it's something super critical, or you just don't know where the question needs to go. At any time, please reach out to me. Program contact questions, for program eligibility, allowability, budget questions, program reporting, contracts, they do so much more, but your program contact can support a lot of this. And then the Opus Help Desk, if you have login issues or energy batch void requests, that can all go to the Opus Help Desk. I think that was all that I was going to be covering today. Are there any other questions? Yay, great. Okay. Well, I would just want to thank Janice and her team for hosting again and having me back. So thank you, everyone. Good to see you all.